Hello, welcome to a celebration of English homes and gardens in the West. I am Caroline Holmes. I'm a garden historian and I love to weave together people, plants and places to tell the story of how they were created and the symbols that lie behind them. And we're starting today flying in, not on the seas, and I'm a regular Viking speaker, so it's always nice to be on the seas. And I had to actually go past St Michael's Mount last year with Viking. And St Michael's Mount stands up from the sea between the celestial blue of the sky and the glorious blue of the seas below. And this picture was taken on a flight from the Scilly Isles, where we're going to go in a moment, as I was coming into Mount Bay, as it's called. And there's a wonderful legend attached to St Michael's Mount, and that was that the Archangel Michael himself was discovered by a fisherman sitting in what looked like a stone chair, and it has been a holy place ever since. Now, for those of you who are not sure what I mean by the West Country, or perhaps want to argue about where the West Country is, I'm going to take 12 sites within Cornwall, starting right on the west, working our way through to Devon and Somerset and Dorset. Those are the counties that I'm going to look at. But you'll see from the numbers, not necessarily in a geographical order, but much more in an order of their specialities, what grows there and everything else. Now, right on the tip, you'll see number 1, Chysauster Village. And that is possibly the most unusual plot that we're going to look at. St Michael's Mount, I've already talked about, which you can see if you come along into Mount Bay, number 2, clearly marked there, not far from number 1. And it also has a history that even predates the Archangel Michael arriving in 495. And this is a very interesting association of Cornwall, that it has tin. And going right back to the Phoenicians, they would come across in their little boats and take tin. And in return, they introduced saffron into Cornwall. And if you're interested in food, a great deal of traditional Cornish food has saffron in it. And then we moved out from the sort of tip of Cornwall to the Scilly Isles, which has a splendid microclimate. Tresco Abbey, as the name suggests, originally an abbey. Then we come up to Heligan, the famous lost gardens of Heligan, which have been very definitely found. Then we're going to look at 1 or 2 castles, and we're going to look at Powderham Castle, and we're going to look at Caerhayes Castle. Powderham is actually, they're both 19th century builds, but Powderham Castle's actual base and foundation goes right the way back into the medieval era. Caerhayes is very much a 19th century notion. Ensley Cottage comes to the fear of Napoleon in the beginning of the 19th century. Pencarrow, right up in the top when you look up there in Cornwall, another very ancient settlement with a lovely sort of Palladian house. Buckland Abbey, another abbey that Henry VIII sort of took back and was then lived in by Francis Drake, our very famous great sailor. Dartington Hall, number 10, was for years a very important arts and crafts centre, and we will go there, and it's the only garden that we're going to look at that was redesigned by landscape architect Beatrix Farrand, who came over from America to do that. Hestercombe takes us into the Edwardian period, but with a backdrop of a very interesting 18th century garden. And last but not least, right over in Dorset, and curiously, the most remote of all the properties we're looking at, Minterne, at Minterne Magna. The little, now those of you who have very sharp eyes will see a little tiny black acorn with Killerton marked by it on the left. And then in the centre, just under Tiverton, you'll see another black acorn. And the other story that runs through all these gardens is the microclimate of the West Country, which has led to many very good plant introductions and 2 excellent nurserymen. So let us start very unexpectedly right back at Chysauster Ancient Village. And you're probably thinking, why have we started just with a map, and a very wet map at that? And I'm fascinated by Chysauster. As it says on the slide that you're looking at, it would appear to have been built in the Roman period, but it probably predates the Roman period by about 100, 150 years. And then it continued for another 200 years until the Romans were very well established. But there's no record of the Romans having come right the way down into the deepest westerly point of Cornwall. And these are groups of houses on high ground, each individually secured, and you can see the way the ground is built up. But what makes it interesting is that everybody would bring all their livestock in at night. And when you look at the remains of the properties, and I've picked house number 1 for you to look at. Now you may say, goodness me, can I see anything? But look at that bottom left-hand image, and you'll see how you would go in. And when I took the photograph, what I was trying to show, because I was fascinated by this, because it links up very much with 18th and 19th century kitchen gardens. The terraces on each of the houses, it was particularly noticeable on house number 1, are inclined towards the south and the east. And with our climate, in the spring, you want to capture that early warm light to get your crops going. And I am certain the people who lived here 2,000 years ago would have been very desperate to get early crops, and they designed their small plots by the houses to supplement the wild food that they were collecting by having these terraced garden areas. Moving back to St Michael's Mount, you can see it. I've put these 2 pictures in. It depends. It is tidal. So either you have to take a boat out to it, or you can walk across the shore, which is very clearly shown in both the images that you can see there. And it was a natural refuge and centre for trade. And as I've already mentioned, goes right the way back to the tin industry, way before the Archangel Michael arrived, I should say. But in 1135, Benedictine monks decided this would be a very good place to have and sort of outshoot from the Abbey. And like Mont Saint-Michel, they were invited over. It was already founded in Mont Saint-Michel in France, off the coast of Normandy, and they made a mirror image. And St Michael's Mount and Mont Saint-Michel are just translations one of the other. And it not only became a very important pilgrimage centre, but because it was a stronghold, it became very important, for example, in our Wars of the Roses, which led up to the Tudors coming to the throne. Then in the Civil War, again, it was a good place to hide out in between 1642 and 1646. But once we get to 1646, St Michael's Mount was then surrendered to Parliament, and the captaincy of the site was given to John St Aubin, and it stayed in the St Aubin family through his descendants, the Lord St Leven, and actually it's been National Trust since 1954. And those of you who are getting your eye in for the plants, you'll see the exotic plantings that we've got, echiums and cordylines and agaves growing up at the base of a sort of proper castle. But then we come to another legend, and that is the legend of the mythical giant cormorant, whose name is there, same as a cormorant but without the T. And he was extremely greedy, and he would come on shore at night and he would eat everybody's stock. And he had a limitless hunger. And young Jack had quite enough. So while at night, he went and dug a very, very, very deep hole, which you can see there on the right. And then he blew his trumpet in the morning, and Cormoran shook awake and fell into this great hole. And his heart lies at the base of the gardens that you can see there. Absolutely wonderful sort of sunken gardens, and very, very good indeed. Now we will move to the Scilly Isles, which, if you remember, you saw just off the toe of Cornwall. Needless to say, it's very exposed, and I'm starting with the plants. Phormium tenax from New Zealand. We're really getting international with our plants, and Pinus radiata from the Monterey Peninsula in America, North America. And you can see how the wind blows there. So the incredibly important thing is to provide shelter. Once you've got shelter from the wind, you have almost no likelihood of frost, and you have lovely sunny days. And the Abbey in the name dates back to when it was in fact an abbey, and you've got just a few archways left. Now, when you look through, the flower that you see there is the gorse, and that will grow anywhere, and that has been much used in the gardens. But who created these gardens? We need to jump to 1834, when an Augustus Smith, described as a handsome man of means, arrived here, and he leased all the Scilly Isles for 99 years from the Duchy of Cornwall. The Duchy of Cornwall belongs to Prince Charles, Duke of Cornwall, and those of you who follow royals will know that Camilla is known as the Duchess of Cornwall, and there are duchy products that you can buy. Anyway, this was leased for 99 years, and he lived on St Mary's initially, and then he was very attracted to Tresco. He felt that it was the most centrally placed and actually the most protected of the islands that were there, and would be protected from the worst of the Atlantic gales. And so he starts planting up and bringing plants in. He also revives the islands, and amongst other things starts a daffodil trade going in. He really didn't just plant a garden, he created a life for the Isles of Scilly. If we start our tour around the gardens, we can see that it's a matter of different paths. And when you arrive on Viking, the ship, little boats bring you in, and then you walk through the island and you come into the gardens of Tresco, and glorious long walks take you all the way down, and you can see packed with plants. There's not a surface that doesn't have some kind of plant, and one can almost always say thriving. On the left, you can see the Pinus radiata, the Monterey pine, very clearly, alongside the palms that you can see very, very clearly. Essentially, there are three major paths, but I might say it's quite easy to get lost, but there are lots of seatings where you can relax as you enjoy the gardens. And because they're not high, because they're islands, but they have used vistas in many, many different parts of the garden. I've mentioned global plants, and here I've combined one or two pictures that I took at Kirchenbosch in South Africa to give you an idea of the microclimate of Tresco and the glorious king protea, the Protea cyanoides, with its lovely pink flowers. And you've got king proteas, you've got giant proteas. They were also described in the 18th century as tree artichokes, and they're endemic to the Western and Eastern Cape. And this is the only place in the UK where they actually naturalise, which is absolutely unheard of. In South Africa, they are much loved by hummingbirds who come and feed on the sweet nectar. Now, in the left-hand image, you will see agaves, and they're going to be my next port call. So we've done South Africa, and now we're going to move back towards the Americas. The difference between an agave and an aloe, or one of the main differences, is you will only get agaves coming from the Americas and aloes typically from Africa and Europe. And the agave has the most amazing symmetry to it in the way that it's able to survive. And when you look at the little corner one there and you think of them in burning heat, each overlapping leaf slightly shades the other one, and that's how they cope. And the slight pubescence that you see on their leaves stops them drying out. The big picture on the left, I talked about those long walks you have when you come through the Abbey Gardens at Tresco. And in the middle, you've got an agave fountain, which is very, very important. But do look at the textures of green that you see very clearly there. And then up in the top right hand corner you've got aeoniums, again love to be very, very dry, and another agave as we looked at earlier on. One of the other unusual plants, I've put them in two situations of the gardens that we're looking at. On the left you've got the puya at Tresco, and on the right the one at St Michael's Mount, taken at different times of the year. But they are extraordinary plants because they sit and they grow and they grow and they grow, and then suddenly it's only when they are wide enough and big enough they put up this very tall central stem, and then they start to flower. But also this is the end for them. They won't survive having done that. It's a native of the Andes and southern Central America. And I might say very nasty barbs all around the flowers. They're not the sort of flowers you would go and pick. Now we're going to have a quick look at nurserymen. So do you remember the black acorn on the map? And that black acorn marked a place called Killerton in Devon. And the house was that of the Ackland family. It burnt down and it was rebuilt, and it's now National Trust. So it's not one of the homes I'm actually going to look at, but I wanted to look at what the Ackland family, if you started, and that was bringing the Veitch, John Veitch, who you can see there on the left, a Scot who came down as head gardener to Devon. And in the 18th century in Britain, the Scots were much better educated than either the English, the Welsh or the Irish. And they got a lot of jobs coming down because they had a work ethic and they were literate. And John Veitch arrives, he works with Thomas Ackland, and these two views, one, as you can see very clearly on the left from Killerton, is through the Celtic Cross looking out across the Devon countryside. And then the one on the right is within the gardens and the enclosure and the really primarily Edwardian development of the garden, complete with sundial and an amazing collection of trees behind. The trees behind are the legacy from the two men that you see here. So John Veitch looks at the potential and the microclimate in Devon and says we can start to grow new and interesting plants. His son James then says, well, actually, we can set up a separate nursery and we will work alongside the Ackland family. And you will see from the heading I've put there, Mrs. Veitch of Exeter and Chelsea. And James and his son then opened a branch in London at Chelsea. And Veitch is a very famous British name as far as gardening is concerned. And they, as their nursery developed, started to support plant hunters. Now, I think possibly you will recognise the next tree, and it's very clearly marked anyway, the monkey puzzle tree. Famously, somebody, when they were looking for a name for it, other than Oricaria oricana, was, you know, what should we call it? And somebody said, well, it would be a tree, and that was at Pencarrow, it would be a tree that would puzzle a monkey. So it became known as the monkey puzzle tree. And I've got two images, as you can see very clearly here. Tregrain in Cornwall, and down below a castle we're not going to, Ugbrook Castle, the only one that actually has a capability brown landscape. The man who is attributed with introducing it, there's a possibility the monkey puzzle tree came in earlier, but William Lobb brought more seeds back than anybody else. And they realized that if you could sell, the Veitches realized that if you got a lot of them actually started, you could have avenues of monkey puzzle trees, which indeed were put in. And William Lobb went on to collect a lot of plants, and we'll come back to him when we get to Pencarrow. Now, the next gardens are the Heligan Gardens, and I very briefly mentioned them as the Lost Gardens of Heligan, and it is an extraordinary story of the late 20th century. They were indeed lost, and they have been beautifully found and restored. And a little background to them. Heligan, the word Heligan actually means willow tree garden, which suggests it is a damp site, which it is, which is very good. Settled by the Normans, by the Arundels of Lanherne, and then the estate was built by, bought and the house built by Sampson Tremaine. In Cornwall, TRE or PEN very often precede surnames. And he came here in 1569. The brick house that was gradually extended, and you can see it is sitting in the centre, is now flat. So I'm not going to be including images of that. And then, as I mentioned, the site was found in 1990. And I remember reading how they gradually said, oh, my goodness, this must be the Italian garden, this must be the jungle garden and everything else. And they have all been restored, and very especially the kitchen garden, which we will look at in a moment. Now, as you look at the shape of the gardens there, they come under the gardenesque style, which was very popular in the early 19th century. And that was, rather than walking straight up the garden, you would walk round and you would admire the different parts of it. And each tree or shrub was something to be celebrated and enjoyed. And you would go into different parts of the garden. It's a rather large idea of garden rooms. And 200 acres of gardens were created by Henry Hawkins Tremaine. That is a very large amount of garden. And they were created in 3 tranches. So you've got the jungle, which we will see has been restored, that was originally created by John Tremaine, 1851-1901. The Lost Valley, and then you've got all the other names. They're all listed there for those of you who are reading through them, and I won't go through every single one, but they are self-explanatory. But this business of the willow and water, you can see particularly on the right hand side how the water runs through the garden and makes a very exciting part. It's a lovely big garden to go and walk around. So we'll start with the kitchen garden, and here we see it now. We go back in our minds to Chysauster, and 2 things to look at. One is that this is south facing. You have the glass, and this is where you really can grow plants that would not necessarily grow in this area. The other element to look at in this walled garden is not only have you got the glass, but you have a solid wall. So the warm air runs up the garden, rolls up the garden, and is held by the brick wall. Conversely, cold freezing air, and we know that cold air sinks down. The other end of the garden has open work gates so that the cold air can roll out, and this stays as a very protective site. And there are, you can see the boxwood edging clipped round to make the different parts. So the big family, the Tremaines, would come down to admire, let's say, the grapes growing in the vinery, or the peaches, or whatever delicious, and then strawberries maybe at Christmas. And then flowers would line the paths so that it looked really nice. And I'm going to show you where these ideas came from. A man called Joseph Paxton, and he was the one who in Britain designed what was called the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park in 1851, the great exhibition building, entirely built of glass. The tax on glass had come off in 1844. And he then, after the 1851 exhibition, it was then moved to Sydenham Park in South London. He said, actually, the big ideas we had there could be taken down into module ideas. Now, this is a very substantial module, new, portable and economical hothouse that you're looking at. But you can see in your own back garden, you could have just a small part of that to very, very good effect indeed. And this was at a time when it was fashionable to have spring and summer bedding plants and put out half-hardy plants, absolutely perfect for that, let alone growing all the fruit that you might want to. Now, I've included this little picture of the melon yard because this is one of the sad elements of the estate at Heligan. So by 1916, the estate was already going downhill. those of you who are aware of world wars will know that 1914 was a critical date when the First World War broke out. And in the melon yard, you can just sort of see the building there. There was actually the privy where they could go, where they're sort of outside loo that they could go and use. And it had sort of plaster work going up. And it said, don't come here to sleep or slumber. In other words, get on with your work. But all the young gardeners who were going off to war signed their name. And when they were restoring this garden in the 1990s, they tied up the names, and all of them had died in the First World War, which, as I say, gives a terrific poignancy to the whole story of Heligan. But before we leave, we will look at the Italian garden. And the Italian garden, I've put a selection of photographs there. Top left-hand corner, black and white. Very simple Italian pavilion there with a typical what was called an Italian lily pool in there. Can't actually see any water lilies in it because see, newly planted up. And so that's all done. Then that picture you can see, the coloured picture at the bottom, is before the restoration started. I don't think you probably needed me to tell you that. And then on the right-hand side, and note the olives in the foreground, there are the gardens newly restored with all the paving all the way around them. So a very happy story of the way that it's all come back. Now, I mentioned that 1916 onwards, the estate went down. It was rented out. In 1943, Americans rehearsed their Normandy landings at Pencarrow Beach, which is very close by, and officers were billeted in the house. Finally, in the 1970s, the Tremaines sold the whole building for flats. And I didn't give you the dates. The Italian garden was, that picture is 1920s, just before it had gone downhill. And it is reputedly the first place that the kiwi was grown in Britain. But let's go to one of the most exciting parts of the garden, I think, and that is the jungle garden. And that was a later addition into the gardens. So they knew the records that it was there. Now, if you remember those pools coming through the plan that we looked at, the 4 interconnecting pools, first one dated back to about 1790, and the other 3 came through in the 1839, about the time that the gardenesque area of the garden was being created. And this, how do you get people through the jungle? And I think it's very clever the way they've done it. They've done it through boardwalk, so they don't impinge on your journey as you go through, and yet it's still accessible. So you have this sense of dense jungle without actually having to go in there with a machete and cut your way all the way through. And then it opens up and you can see the water there in the bottom right hand corner. It's a very steep sided valley as you go in, and it's 60 varieties of bamboos, 3 champion trees, Pinus samburgia, Cedrella sinensis and Podocarpus totara. And finally, let's move on to staying with those ideas and exotica. We're going to go with the tree fern, and you may have spotted quite a few tree ferns growing in the jungle there. Tree ferns are from Australasia, and this is the time, it's 1888 is the centenary of settlement in Australia. And there was a great deal of interest in the idea of that Australia was part of the British Empire, but yet very different, and the plantings were very different. And so paintings such as Isaac Whitehead's painting you can see here in the Sassafras Valley, Victoria, gave people an idea back in Britain that, you know, maybe they could have a little of that kind of excitement in their own gardens. We were very little in the way of pioneering when we went through our own forests, as you can see here. But what you've got with the tree ferns, and you can see them dominating the foreground of Isaac Whitehead's painting that's there, which brings me, as I said, to our next West Country nurseryman. So a man called John Garland Tressida went with his 2 brothers to Australia in 1857 to take part in the gold rush that built up Melbourne and the area around there in Victoria. But he loved gardening, and he put various seeds in his pockets to take to grow. And he didn't really take to the gold rush. I think probably didn't do very well, but he set up a market garden growing both flowers and vegetables that people remembered from that old home country, which they certainly still did at that particular period. And it proved to be very successful indeed. And the nursery developed. He set up a shop in Sydney. He then designed parks and gardens in New South Wales and Victoria. And as he worked in both Victoria and New South Wales, he thought the climate here is not that different from Cornwall. And he loved tree ferns. They are so majestic as to eclipse all, he used to say. So he wrote back to people he knew in Cornwall and said, would you like a tree fern? So let us look at the next image. And here we see them growing very magnificently at Heligan. And they are quite extraordinary. They have almost no roots at all. The gunnera, you can see the Chilean rhubarb down below, which does very well in the water. Tresco finally decided he'd come back to Cornwall, and he became the man to go to if you wanted to have tree ferns in your gardens. And they became a follow-up to the sort of fernomania that had been going on in the 19th century in England. And he wrote to people like Jonathan Rashley at Menabilly. And that became Daphne du Maurier's house. And in 1890, he wrote, dear sir, I'm glad to hear the Dixonias have arrived in good condition and will book 6 more to be sent you when the season comes around again. They then settled in Truro, and Tresco's of Truro still exist, and they evolved to become one of the largest collectors of ornamental plants in the UK. They imported all sorts of Australasian plants, cordyline, phormium, eucalyptus, mimosa, pittosporum, and then they started exporting them worldwide. So they are very important in the plant history of the West Country. Now we're going to go to castles. So Powderham Castle, actually we're looking at a very sort of 19th century castle, but it is a fascinating castle, seats of the Earls of Devon, and it literally sits on the mouth of the River Exe that in turn leads up to Exeter, if you can recall the map we were looking at earlier on. It comprises an estate of 3,500 acres with 4 farms, woodland, 33 houses, and 3 miles of foreshore, along which they actually built the railway, which is quite another thing. And it is the seats of the Earls of Devon, and they are mentioned in the Domesday Book. So they long tenure, I think one could say. And the family name is Courtney, and the Hugh de Courtney married Margaret de Bohun, who was fortunately an heiress, and he became the first Earl of Devon in 1325. Now, the name Courtenay is a French name, and they came over in the reign of Henry II, and they continued to marry rich heiresses. Now, if we move back to Hugh and Margaret, they had 8 sons and 9 daughters, so their lineage was ensured, I think one could say without a shadow of a doubt. Margaret outlived Hugh, and Powderham went to her 6th son, Philip, and it was Sir Philip who began building the basis of the castle that is there back in 1390. Jumping 300 years ahead, or 250 years ahead, the Civil War, Britain's Civil War between King Charles I and Parliament, was very exciting stories in the West Country. Read Daphne du Maurier's The King's General if you want to learn more about that. But Exeter was of strategic importance, and I've said to you, this castle lies on the mouth of the River Exe as you're going up towards Exeter. And just a little bit of royal history. Queen Henrietta Maria gave birth to her youngest daughter here before fleeing to France. So there we are. That's a little bit of a royal happening that went on there. Then it stayed a royalist outpost, faithful to King Charles. Then 19th century, it was all renovated, which is what you can see. And then in 1959, when the castle first opened to the public, they put a new entrance on the north side that we're looking at here. Just to run through the rest of the history while we're looking at that very, very quickly, actually, no, I will move on to the next image and we'll look at that one. Let's go to that. And you will see, and we'll go back with the Courtney family. So we've got Sir William Courtney, 1735, he inherits. And 1762, he was created first Viscount Courtney of Powderham, 10 days before his death. His son, the second Viscount, married Frances Clack in 1762, and they had 14 children, 13 daughters and 1 son. He converted the chapel into a library. Now, I want you to look at the different colours that you've got on the plan there. So 1390, I've mentioned that's when the sort of first building started, which you can see at the core of the castle. Then the 1710, 1727, their status is improving, and you've got those rather lovely windows put on that gives the whole thing a little bit more majesty. Then 1766 to 9, just the one green part that you can see there, another new wall, 1795, and then that 19th century additions that were put on was by Charles Fowler. And we've got a combination of the different parts there. Looking at the bottom left, you will see that central tower. You can see it in the top there. We need to remember that to get high was really difficult. And it was a very strategic position, and you never knew what was going to happen. And we did have the Napoleonic worries. That was also a belvedere, somewhere you could watch out exactly what was going on there. Now, the pink one the green one is the music room. I should have said that. And that was designed by John Nash, who designed the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. So very important person to have there. So William Courtney finally inherits another William Courtney, and he's the son of the Bishop of Exeter, his uncle having had no children. And he becomes 10th Earl of Devon, and it's he who calls in Charles Fowler to do all the 19th century work that you can see very, very clearly. Now, what you can't really see in my photograph in the bottom right-hand corner, but it's where the garden ends is where the railway is. And in 1844, the South Devon Atmospheric Board Gauge Railway was constructed through Powderham, linking Exeter with Dawlish, and Isambard Kingdom Brunel was chief engineer and became a business colleague of Lord Courtney. If we look at the next picture, look at that, you've got the Belvedere, and then you've got the green that looks like Virginia Creeper. It is not Virginia Creeper, as you will see in the next image. It is actually wisteria. Now, wisteria is another plant that is very important to this homes and gardens. When I'm asked by people on international programs I do now, how would you define English homes and gardens? They say you cannot have one without the other. And I think when we look at these two properties and we're coming on to Carehays, we can see that very clearly. The wisteria was introduced in the early 1800s, actually into Kew Gardens. And it is a plant that grows everywhere through the British Isles now. And lovely scent, very much associated with pergolas. We'll see that when we get to Hestercombe. And it also has the association with sort of Japanese art that we can see here, the young woman with wisteria by Agatha Gecko. And it's one of 5 dances. And this is the kabuki that she's dancing there. And it captures the moment when she realizes her love is not reciprocated and she just morphs into a painting. And wisteria paints the buildings that it grows on and absolutely enhances them with something very, very exciting, very much a signature Edwardian plant. Now we go on to our next image. We come to Carehays. Gothic, and note the C, K at the end of the Gothic castle. 19th century dream castle. John Nash, who I've already mentioned, who designed the Royal Pavilion for the Prince Regent at Brighton. So there were already buildings, had been buildings on this site. And we'll go and look at the story while you're looking at this castle that sits so picturesquely in its landscape at the perfect moment for the rhododendrons. So you have the camellias, followed by the rhododendrons and the magnolias. It's an amazing plant collection that you've got here. So the actual family who originally owned the site, Trevanion, another one with a T-R-E, going back to 1390, but we've come all the way along with the Trevanion family. 1801, age 21, John Trevanion inherits, and he wants to have a splendid castle. So he's made a lot of money on mining royalties, and he says, right, the sky's the limit. In comes John Nash and designs what we see here. And John Nash, 1808, as you can see clearly. But sadly, by 1824, Trevanion is bankrupt. But somebody says it's one of those awful moments that one of the things he could do was, they are very good friends with Angela Burdett Coutts, as in Coutts Bank, and why not ask her over and see if she wouldn't like to give you some money for this wonderful place. But unfortunately, she arrived and their dog bit her footman, and so she left in high dudgeon and left no money whatsoever. But so let's look a bit more at Carehays and see what happens here. Nash created a lake, which you can just see as you look down beyond the castle in the bottom right-hand corner there. And that lake lies between the castle and the edge of the cliffs. It's rather a clever way of having it there. And the cliffs are on Porthlooney Cove and Verrian Bay as you go around. So 1853, finally, the castle finds a new owner in the form of the Williams family. And you can see Camellia Cross Williams Eye donation, which is giving you a clue to what very keen plants people they were, and indeed still are. Now, the Williams had also made their fortune in mining. Sadly, a fire destroyed most of the furniture, but the actual building survived. And knowing the microclimate here, J.C. Williams, who'd bought it, introduced lots of new plants from all the way around the world. Then 1990, we had terrible winds in 1987, but there was another one in 1990, did a lot of damage actually in France, and that took out a lot of the very mature specimens. And so the upper parts of the garden have more recently been redesigned, but they're very, very effective. So that there are all sorts of different camellias that they grow, and donation was possibly one of the best ones, but actually was bred by William's very good friend at Borde Hill, Stevenson Clark, and he managed to make the cross that you see in the lovely camellia that's there. Now we're going to go on one more, and staying in the beginning of the 18th century, we're going to go to Plymouth. Now, I very briefly mentioned that there was a fear of Napoleonic invasion. 1789 is the French Revolution. Napoleon comes to power, and from the beginning of the 1800s, we are very seriously concerned, particularly in southern Britain, that we will be invaded by Boney, as he was known. And Plymouth, you can see on the map, and we've already seen it on the other map, and you'll see Exeter there very clearly indeed. Now, the areas around Plymouth with the black dots were all areas that were owned by the Duke of Bedford. And actually all the black dots are Humphrey Repton commissions. And I should just quickly tell you, Humphrey Repton followed after Capability Brown. He became a professional landscape gardener in 1788. And his speciality was he would go to sites. You can see very popular around London and Windsor. He actually came from East Anglia, born in my hometown of Bury St Edmunds. He would provide you with beautiful watercolours of what your garden would look like if you commissioned him. And what we're looking at here are his series of watercolours for Ensley, as it was named, which is near Plymouth. So the idea was Plymouth was very attractive anyway. Let's get the tourists coming down here. It was very fashionable, later 18th, beginning of 19th century, to travel around Britain. It was also more dangerous to go abroad because of the French Revolution. And by improving these areas and by having things like lodge gates and lodge houses, you hoped you were protecting more of Britain. So here at Ensley, you can see very, very clearly his picturesque theory brought into landscape design. So he said, what you want is you have your garden literally like a picture. So the foreground is very ordered with lovely flower beds. The little one you can see at the top was actually for the Duke of Bedford's children to play in, and that was their garden. They've got a very similar one near Bedford at Woburn. On the left, the idea of a dramatic background, which of course is perfect in Devon, because you could climb up and there was the temple on the top and a little rustic cottage at the bottom. And Humphrey Repton always said whoever lived in the cottages on the estate had to keep a fire going all the year round, because the fleecy folds of white smoke were very pleasing for people and made them feel that all was well in the world. Coming round, another bit of drama down there at the bottom, and on the right hand side particularly, you can see the way the gardens are stretched out and the idea of a walk and somewhere where you can sit and look out and enjoy all the wonderful views that are there. The Bedfords had 15,000 acres, I should have said, in Devon, and it was the 6th Duke who commissioned Repton. Now, if we go to near Tavistock, this is where the Ensley cottage was built that I mentioned when we looked at your first map. And it is now a hotel. It's a rather nice story behind it. And Repton himself said, everything that can contribute to the enjoyment of the scenery, I know must contribute to the enjoyment of the neighbouring country in its agriculture, its mineralogy, its civilization, and the general happiness of all who dwell within the influence of the cottage on the banks of the Tamar, and that's the river that comes down from Tavistock. The Bedfords owned this property but didn't know what to do with it, and it sort of fell into a bit of disrepair. Then in 1955, fishing friends were formed, and Olga Polizzi, who was the daughter of the late Lord Forty, finally acquired it in the 2000s and then has made it into a very delightful hotel. And you can absolutely see that the gardens have been recreated. And this is very much what we would call a cottage ornée when you're looking at it. So on to our next property, which is Pencarrow. Now, Pencarrow is near Washaway, and it's the home of the Molesworth family. And we're back with who has the oldest roots in our tour of homes and gardens of the West Country. And arguably, we could go to Pencarrow because it had an Iron Age settlement, so going way back into the BCs. And if you look at the map on your left, you'll see that the drive actually brings you through what's marked as ancient British encampment. That was an Iron Age fort dwelling settlement. And you come all the way through. Now, as you're coming through, just below the ancient British encampment, you can see American Garden, Wishing Well, Lake, Ice House, Palm House. We are standing there as we look down onto Pencarrow, which lies at the foot of a valley. And Simon Jenkins has written a wonderful book called England's 1,000 Best Houses. And he writes, the family is that of the Molesworth St Albans, whose tree since the 16th century is a spider's web of Cornish gentry. It could at one point march on family land across much of the West Country. Now, the gardens we're looking down, you can see around the house and working up there with the American gardens and so on, were laid out by Sir William Molesworth, who employed John Lobb, father of William Lobb, who we looked at in relation to the monkey puzzle tree. And he worked here between 1831 and 1855. Now, Molesworth was a radical politician, and he rose to be Secretary of State for the colonies. And he created a mile-long drive lined with, guess what, monkey puzzle trees. And on his death, Sir William could boast that he had planted every hardy pine known to man except 2. And if we just go on to the next one, we will see the house at closer quarters and get a better idea. Now, the house was started by the 4th Sir John Molesworth and completed by the 5th, who succeeded in 1766 and died, in fact, 9 years later in 1775. Now, the 5th Sir John had considerable mining investments. We keep hearing that this was the way that people did make money in the West Country. And he formed a banking house named Sir John Molesworth and Company, and he joined forces with John Eliot of Port Eliot and Humphrey Praed of London. And that is the origins of the Lloyds Bank, for anybody who's into British banking. Now, the house you're looking at was designed by Robert Allinson, who very sadly died aged only 38. So it would have been interesting to see what he might have also designed if he hadn't died quite so young. He designed that in 1773. And I talked about Palladian style. It's a very simple Palladian style, but the symmetry is very pleasing. The colour sits very nicely in the landscape. It has a glorious symmetry. Look at the details over the sash windows that you can see very clearly. The 4 evenly placed doors as you make your way round. It sits in its landscape. It doesn't grow out of its landscape. It's very much in a sort of architectural relationship with the landscape that you can see. And on the left-hand bottom corner that you can see there, I should have said about the roof, it's Cornish Delabole slate roof for those who are interested in rocks and so on. And the American garden and Himalayan garden, they went and got granite from Bodmin Moor. You saw that on the map, not the Bodmin Moor, but the granite coming down to make the effects. And you can just see it popping through there with these lovely pink azaleas in flower on the top there. And the Italian garden was also made out of granite, which you can see looking over with the fountain there in the middle. And the reasons that they managed to get all this granite all the way from Bodmin Moor is that Molesworth had looked after the tenants beautifully at the time of our 1832 repeal of the Corn Laws, when many people went very hungry. So that was their thank you to him for all that he had done. And that corner down there in the bottom is the Victorian rock garden, which is reputedly the oldest in the country. Now we go on to our next image, and we're going to go back to an abbey. Now, I barely talked about the abbey origins of Tresco Abbey when we were there, and it was a sister house of Tavistock. Buckland Abbey was also near Tavistock. And this is an example. We had what was called the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s, when Henry VIII famously wished to marry Anne Boleyn and saw a way of getting an awful lot of money, and got a team of men who got together and dissolved the monasteries, and then they were rewarded with the monasteries to have as their own private houses, putting it in very simple terms, as a thanks from Henry VIII. So if you look carefully, you can see traces of the abbey that's actually there. Now, it was originally a Cistercian abbey founded in 1278 by Amicia, Countess of Devon, and it's a daughter house of Quor Abbey on the Isle of Wight. Like Tavistock Abbey, it was dissolved at the same time between 1536 and 1541. And Henry VIII sold the abbey to Sir Richard Grenville. Grenville and his grandson converted it into a house, but unusually they retained the church, which you don't, as I say, you don't normally get. Now, its famous connection comes in 1581. Francis Drake is knighted and wishes to have a suitable property, and he comes to Buckland Abbey. He had circumnavigated the world between 1577 and 1580. So let's jump to Francis Drake. And here we look down and you get a much better idea of the size of Buckland Abbey as we look down on it. And it's now National Trust. I should first of all say Francis Drake sea captain, privateer, navigator, slaver, pirate and politician who rose to be one of Elizabeth's vice admirals. And he lived here for 15 years, and his descendants continued to live here until 1946. When they sold it to Arthur Rodd, a local landowner, and he presented it a couple of years later to the National Trust. But it was a very happy home for Drake. And first of all, Vita Sackville West, who was involved with the early years of the National Trust, suggested a herb garden because of its Elizabethan connections. And then more recently, they've put in a whole Elizabethan garden, which you can see there in front, with a sort of trellised fence all the way around, circular central water feature, and the very formal laid out beds. Many of you will have heard the story of Drake's Drum, and if you go to Buckland, you can see Drake's Drum. What is the story behind Drake's Drum? Well, as he lay dying off the coast of Panama, he said, "Please take my drum back to Buckland Abbey." And he promised that in times of danger, if he heard the drum beating, he would return to come to their aid. So, has it ever drummed? Oh, yes. Apparently it drummed when the Mayflower left Plymouth in 1620. It drummed again when Admiral Lord Nelson was made a freeman of Plymouth. These are all celebrations, one would imagine. When Napoleon was brought as a prisoner to Plymouth, and at the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. And apparently the last time it was heard was 1940, at the time of the Dunkirk retreat. So there it is, Drake's Drum. Moving into arts and crafts, we will go on to Dartington Hall. And here you have a lovely juxtaposition of centuries of history. In the foreground here, we have Henry Moore's wonderful reclining woman, and she's right at the top of the gardens. You'll see this in a moment. And I've used this particular image of Dartington Hall because we look down the slopes, those are actually the tilt yard, and up to the clipped yew, and we look beyond, we can just see the remains of the old Dartington Hall, and beyond there, still thriving and still somewhere where you can go and dine, is the original medieval Great Hall. And you can see under scaffolding the church there on the right-hand side. Now, the Great Hall, 1390, I keep talking about 1380s and 1390, a lot happening at the time. It was built for the first Duke of Exeter, John Holland, and he married Elizabeth of Lancaster. And you may remember the Tudors were divided between Yorkists and Lancastrians. She was the daughter of John of Gaunt, he of This Sceptred Isle famous speech. And John Holland was the son of Joan, the Fair Maid of Kent, by her first husband, stay with me, Thomas Holland, 1st Earl of Kent. Now, he died and Joan married again, and she married Edward the Black Prince, and their child was Richard II, which is a lengthy way of saying John Holland, 1st Duke of Exeter, was half-brother to Richard II, who incidentally was born on the 6th of January and felt he was destined to be a king, because obviously with having the Epiphany as his birthday was sure to be the reason why he was going to be king, and indeed he was. So the yews that you can see around the church date back over 1,000 years. So let's take a tour of the gardens. The courtyard, so we've got a combination of different images that you can see here, and I want to just quote from Mark Gerard. Life in the English house. At Dartington Hall in Devon, there is a variant arrangement, perhaps dating from the late 14th century. The first floor lodgings also have external doorways approached by long flights of external stairs framing the doors of the lodgings below. Who went where in lodgings of this type is largely a matter of guesswork. It seems that they were for the household and some for guests, and that the less important servants and visitors were put 2 or more to a room. And he then adds probably 2 or more to a bed. So that relates to the image you can see up there in the top left-hand corner. Dorothy and Leonard Elmhurst came here in 1925, and she had a large fortune of her own, and called over Beatrix Farrand to come and discuss how they were going to do the landscape. They had the whole hall restored, but they wanted to make it a centre for their liberal dreams. And Beatrix Farrand came backwards and forwards from the United States to do the designs. And she said, you want to keep the approach to the Great Hall as simple as possible. Grass, paths, retain the trees, but don't make it fussy. And that little stag you can see set in the red rose is Richard II's heraldic device, which is why I put it in. So there she is, Beatrix Farrand comes. She also designs the rest of the gardens for them. Now, when I talk about what happened after the Elmhursts, and it sadly has just stopped, but it became such an important centre for festivals of literature, cinema, arts, crafts. The founding of Dartington Crystal all have their origins coming back here. Now, if we go into the gardens and we see much more garden, we can see the different ideas that Beatrix Farrand had. She was then followed up by Percy Kane as well. Top left-hand corner, isn't that wonderful? That was built for the children, the Elmhurst children, to have their own little cottage in the garden with its little, following on from what we've just seen at Ensley, that was done by Repton for the Duke of Bedford. Right-hand side, and if you look carefully at the top, you can see the Henry Moore sculpture there right on the top steps, called the tilt yard. Well, if you tried tilting in this space, there simply isn't enough space to do it. But as a landform, it is absolutely beautiful. And in the spring, each of those steps is covered in primroses. It really is lovely. And then we come to two pieces of the garden that were followed up. Percy Kane used Beatrix Farrand steps, but made more of them and put the lovely swan sculpture that you can see there. Again, wonderful area for azaleas, grow brilliantly here. And then most recently, Preben Jackson, that lovely yellow and sort of purple lavender coloured border that's at the base of the long terrace that comes out from the Great Hall that we saw very, very clearly there. Now we're going to go to Hestercombe. We are heading up towards our last properties. This is the penultimate, Hestercombe. Cobbleston War Bamfield was an 18th century gentleman who was also a very gifted watercolourist. And his property was near Taunton, and he regularly went up to Bath, and he painted on commission for various people. And behind his house, so here, typical 18th century style, you sweep up to the house. The park around it is used for grazing animals. And then on our left, going up the hill, he created a very typical 18th century garden that you can see the sketch of on the right-hand side. So at its base, you have a lovely sinuous lake form where you can do fishing, where you could take a boat out, or you could have wildfowl, which you can see very clearly. And then you've got a stream that works its way up through the landscape, totally artificial. And finally, at the very top, you have a temple. And there were seats on the way and other follies of various kinds. So I could spend a whole session just talking about Hestercombe. The bottom left, you can see the restoration that's been done in the last 25 years and done absolutely beautifully. They found all the original channels very, very clearly there. So staying with Hestercombe, this just briefly to show the quality of Bamfield's watercolours. This is his painting of the waterfall, the cascade that he created behind the lake we've just been looking at. And on the right hand side is a photograph of the restoration, and you can see what a beautiful job they've done. And as we look at this, the one thing I can't show at all are the sounds and the smells. So we've looked at lots and lots of plants, many of which would have been scented. Many attract birds, even though they're exotic plants. And then with all the water, you have the sound of the cascading water. And all of that plays, and the noise, with something like phormiums, of the leaves in the wind that's here. But it is a wondrous, wondrous sight. Now, Hestercombe fell into a little bit of disrepair, but then Viscount Portman was here, and in the early 1900s, 1906, he called, 1904 to be exact, he called Edwin Lutyens in to see what could be done about the gardens. Edwin Lutyens described the house as a sporting squire of a house. He thought it was absolutely hideous and said there was nothing he could do, but suggested growing Virginia creeper all the way over it, which he duly did. But I wanted to take you back with water ideas and into the beginning of the 20th century. Edwin Lutyens' great partner, or I should say Gertrude's great partner, was Edwin Lutyens. Gertrude Jekyll trained as an artist and became arguably our most famous impressionist gardener. She was also a very keen embroiderer, and she described the way she put these rills through the gardens as a manner of the gathered ribbon strap work of ancient needlework. And you can see them both running through there. So they run side by side of the grand plat that you can see on the right hand picture within the right hand. We'll look at the grand plat in a moment. Then at the end, the origeron is like a sort of froth that implies that the water is frothing through, which it's not. And then do look at the wonderful reflective qualities that the rill gives to the garden. Now, if we come through to our next image, we have a look around, a final look around Hestercombe. So there is our hideous house, bottom left-hand corner, duly covered in Virginia creeper. The Grand Plat is a sunken garden, and each wall has a different aspect, and we are looking at it from the Lutyens seat, and as we look in the wall, we see every single part of it is filled with Mediterranean plants because it's dry, it's sunny. And then we look across, and on the bottom right hand corner you've got the steps up towards the Mediterranean garden, and if you look in your top right hand corner you can see a plan that's been drawn up, a scheme of the way the gardens operate, and you can see those rills we've just been looking at. And we couldn't leave Hestercombe, and we can't leave Edwardian gardens without looking at pergolas. They were a wonderful way. All the new climbing plants that were coming in from China and from Japan and from Korea, from Asia in general, were perfect for training over pergolas, which we can see very, very clearly. Now, our final property is Minterne House. And Minterne House arguably is the most remote, although it's the furthest east of all the properties that we are looking at. And it has fascinating people who've lived there, and I couldn't resist just putting a little bit of detail about one or two of them. So around 1550, Minterne and nearby Cerne Abbas were owned by the wardens and scholars of Winchester College. Then we jump to 1660, and the estate was leased to Sir Winston Churchill, whose portrait you can see very clearly there. Yes, it is from him that John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, and finally our own great wartime Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, are descended. And I wanted, but the women, we've got the women in this particular picture. So we've got Jane Elizabeth Digby twice. And she was the most extraordinary 18th century woman, very, very briefly. So I should say, note the name Digby. The Churchills actually stopped living there in 1768, and Admiral Robert Digby takes over. And I should have mentioned that first of all. And he was a younger brother of the then Lord Digby at Sherborne Castle. And the portraits that you can see here of Jane Elizabeth Digby, 1807 to 1881, she had 4 husbands and many lovers. And I'll just give you a little tabloid list. They are Earl Edward Law, Governor General of India, King Ludwig I of Bavaria and his son, King Otto of Greece, Bohemian nobleman and Austrian statesman Prince Felix Ludwig Schwarzenberg, and the Greek general Christoulos Hatzipetros. She died in Damascus, Syria, as the wife of the Arab Sheikh Majul el Mezrab, who was 20 years her junior. do read her life, her biography by Mary Lovell, A Scandalous Life. It's absolutely fascinating, particularly if you're interested in the Middle East. Now, down at the bottom left-hand corner, we come full circle from the Churchill there on the right to the Churchills, as possibly all of us who are watching know, Winston Churchill. His son, Randolph, married Pamela Digby, and they had children together, but it was not a very successful marriage. And she was employed during the war by Beaverbrook. In fact, he saved her bacon because she would have been very, very short of money had he not employed her. When she started an affair with Averil Harriman, who later became her third husband. Her second husband was Broadway producer Leland Hayward. And then shall we have a few other lovers while we're at it? Prince Ali Khan, Stavros Niarchos, Gianni Agnelli, and Baron Elie de Rothschild. She then, as Pamela Harriman, becomes US ambassador to Paris. And such was her ability in that role that Bill Clinton, actually when she died, had her dispatch the Air Force One to bring her body back, and President Chirac placed the Grand Cross of the Légion d'Honneur on her coffin. So she was quite an extraordinary woman. That is enough about the women. Let's get back to Minton. So Minton itself, the Lord Digby at Sherborne originally commissioned Capability Brown, but there is no evidence that he came to Minterne House. But if you look at the very sinuous water features that survive there, you can see that Lord Digby took his ideas, Admiral Digby took his ideas from his brother, and they still exist there today. And so a lot of trees were removed when Admiral Digby came here. He removed the formal gardens and just had more of a landscape approach. And in the top right-hand corner, you can see the very typical 18th century house that was within the landscape at that time. He altered the house, rebuilt the stables and outbuildings, and he created a new kitchen garden, rather like we saw at Heligan, although a little earlier. We jump to 1863, and Robert 9th Baron Digby inherits, and he starts a shrub and rhododendron collection, which was continued by his son. That's Pamela's father, Edward 10th Lord Digby, after he had inherited the estate in 1889. The house continued to be changed. If you look at the top right-hand corner and the bottom left-hand corner, you can see how it's evolving, and trying to find which bit relates to what is quite interesting. However, in 1900, they discovered an enormous amount of dry rot, and the whole thing had to be pulled down. Now, before we look at the next house, let us look at the Himalayan garden that was created during the 19th and 20th centuries. And I've talked about all the rhododendrons coming in. Many, many different varieties were planted at Minterne, and they came from Wilson, Farrar, Kingdom Ward, primarily China and Japan. And the 10th Lord Digby also travelled here to collect seedlings and ordered them from nurseries where he went. By 1955, there were over 350 rhododendron species here, and 700 hybrids were counted as well as that. These are very spring shots at Minterne, so you get a lovely sense of the low light, the sound of the water, the pink of the rhododendrons, the wonderful moss that grows in this lovely, lovely damp climate. So if we move on, we will see what house exists there now. And that is Arts and Crafts. Leonard Stokes designed it in Ham Hill, which has that lovely sort of orangey, warm colour to it. And you can see that with the magnolia at the side of the house. And it was on the same footprint. And Leonard Stokes went on to be president of REBA. It didn't design very many domestic buildings, best known for Catholic churches. But if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that same idea of having a viewing tower that's really very, very good indeed. Wonderful gabled dormers that you can see, which has a sort of suggestion of Elizabethan West Country. And then you can see vignettes all the way around. Now, if we go on again, in conclusion, if you're looking really for any English home or English village, it will have a church at its centre. And as you come out of Minton, there is the little church of St Andrew, and it just brings together so much of what I've been talking about. Now, those who've got very good eyesight will see the church. In the foreground, you've got a large yew tree. And that is probably a very ancient yew tree. I don't think it's 1,000 years old like we saw at Dartington, but it's a very ancient yew tree. Pinned onto it is free range eggs. So you need to go to your right and you can get free range eggs. To your left are two signs. On the top, bridle way. This is definitely riding country. And on the post, the bus timetable, because the bus stop stops just there. Then you see the wonderful Dorset landscape going away, and it really is very remote when you go down there. Within the church, you've got in the floor the stone to Ellen Churchill, daughter of Winston Churchill, that first Winston Churchill we saw, who was sister to John, who in turn became the first Duke of Marlborough and built Blenheim. There is another little picture of the Himalayan garden with the rhododendron all in flower. And last but not least, I've talked a bit about the Napoleonic fear, and fear not, because Sir Henry Digby, Admiral of the Blue, was out there fighting Napoleon under the command of Nelson and fought at the very famous Battle of Trafalgar. So thank you very much indeed. It's been quite a lengthy tour of the gardens of the West Country, and I look forward at some point to being back on a Viking UK gardens tour when we get a chance to talk about these things again. But I hope to meet you on one or other of the Viking cruises that I'll be taking. And as I mentioned, next one up will be going from Aqaba to Piraeus. Thank you so much indeed. Hello, I'm here to answer any questions. I shall look forward to receiving them, and we'll see if I can talk a little bit more about what you've been enjoying. So my first question, please.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Caroline. So our first question for you this evening is from Martha, who is in Atlanta. And she asks, can you tell us how and when the Roman village of Chysauster was discovered? And are there any ongoing archaeological excavations at the site?
Thank you. Very good question, Martha. In actual fact, Chysauster isn't Roman. You're absolutely right with your dates and thinking, gosh, this must be a Roman race. But the Romans indeed took over, not quite Scotland, but all of the British Isles. But they, for some reason, the Chysauster village predates the Romans and remains as a sort of ancient Britain settlement rather than a Roman settlement. So from that point of view, it's still a very interesting historic site. And there are similar remains on Tresco, as I mentioned. But yes, it's under the care of English Heritage, which is the body that we have here in England particularly for castles, Iron Age forts, older properties. And it goes, I might say, right up. There are more modern properties, but it is very carefully preserved. And one of the wonderful words for tonight, the fogu, which is the sort of passageway that goes through, is a term that's particularly used in Cornwall. And because particularly with archaeology, knowledge increases all the time. So there are movements to uncover, investigate, to carefully record, and in other cases to actually leave what's there in the hopes that another decade will mean that there's a greater knowledge to investigate. But really, we're not looking at an important Roman settlement down there. They kept well out of the way of the Romans at that particular time. But lovely question, thank you.
Lovely, Thank you, Caroline. And our next question comes from Dawn, who is in the US. And she asks, what is the best time of year to visit the gardens in the west of England? Is it spring or summer which is most colourful?
Very good question as well, Dawn. Thank you for asking me that. It depends what your interest is. So here we go. From the point of view of visiting Britain, Cornwall, particularly Cornwall, is ahead of the rest of the country. It's warmer. The sea keeps the frost away, so you sort of start with wonderful primroses and very early daffodils. So very, very early spring, late winter, early spring. And it depends where your interest lies. So if your interest lies with, shall we say, camellias, with bulbs, then really you can go in March and enjoy a lovely early spring warm sunshine. Then we come, so I'm going to say to you, really, you should be coming at any possible time of the year. Then from a broader point of view, once you get into April, May, you've got many, many plants and flowers, trees, shrubs that will be in flower. And you've got the rhododendrons starting. So where camellias grow, because they like acidic soil, rhododendrons also like acidic soil, which takes me back actually to Atlanta, which is Atlanta Botanical Garden has the most wonderful acid soil and collection of acid loving plants. But we're here in the west of England, so I must continue with that. So you're looking magnolias coming in. There's the hillsides you saw in that picture of Carehays, where the whole hillside is covered. Their speciality is camellias, but that colour will go on March, April and into May. When we come to the summer, now I'm a keen sea swimmer, so if you want to do a little bit of sea swimming as well as looking at gardens, I would suggest that you can't do better than visiting the West Country during the summer. And you will have where flowers are used, so let's look in terms of annual flowers that are put to give colour and pattern into gardens. We also have the lovely big deep traditional herbaceous borders. They will be at their best in the summer. So it's really, what are you looking for? And I'm afraid I'm going to add to that if you come in the autumn, you will then see all the fruits and the kitchen gardens will be at their best. But I really can't decide which would be my best season to go there. So really, I would look at what you're interested in. If your interests are particularly actually in introduced plants, so we're talking, as I say, camellias, and then rhododendrons earlier in the year will be your time to really come and enjoy them. Then when we get later in the year, you've got a much broader sweep. And I mentioned, about the Tresidors introducing tree ferns, which if you have an interest in Australian flora, that tends to come and is at its best, taking us right the way into the summer. And I was with Viking in August, and we saw some fabulous West Country gardens where you can go, and particularly the ones that have gone for the sort of jungle look. You saw that. I showed you at Heligan how they've created the jungle garden that's there. Absolutely. So anytime. Winter, I think not so much winter. It can be very, very blustery, but along I've talked about swimming. Also, if you like walking, and I know Viking did 2 lovely walks last year. I went on both of them. One was just called the Jurassic Coast, not Jurassic Park, but the Roseland Peninsula, if you're interested in naturalized and wildflowers, and that was in August, and we saw a great deal at that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And our next question for you comes from Peter, who is in Brookville. And he says, wow, those camellias at Carehays Castle look beautiful. I'd love to go and see them one day. His question is, who lives in the castle now, and do they maintain the passion for the gardens?
Oh, thank you for allowing me to reiterate. Yes, the Williams family very definitely still live there, and they're very involved in the horticultural world. We have our Royal Horticultural Society. Cornwall has a big garden show in April. Yes, they are very involved. They are continuing to do breeding programs and introducing new varieties. And if you go round the gardens, they will label, you know, this is a cross between this and that, and you really get an insight into the plants. And so, yes, the camellia, and also you can go around the house as well, which is fascinating.
Perfect. Thank you, Caroline. And our next question is from Alexander, who is in Miami. His question is, it must have been a huge project to restore the gardens at Heligan. Can you tell us more about the process, for example, how it was funded and how the gardens are maintained today?
Yes, indeed, it was an extra. I remember when they first, I write sort of rather, everybody says, oh, well, the lost gardens of Heligan have very definitely been found. But it's one of those extraordinary stories. Tim Schmidt is a name, and I don't think I mentioned his name when I was talking about the Heligan Gardens. He, wanted to bring back, if any of you have been to the Eden Project, which I didn't talk about, he also created the Eden Project in Cornwall. He was very conscious that the further west you go in England, the poorer it is. Yes, it has the tourist trade, but it needs more to bring people in. And the Heligan was literally sort of sleeping beauty, and it was really falling into disarray. So if we go back into the 1980s, I remember seeing the very first photographs, and Tim Schmidt absolutely sold the story. Now I've got to get myself absolutely right, because it transpired, and Tree Bar Gardens, which I didn't include, which are well worth visiting as well. Tree Bar, Tony Hibbert owned Tree Bar, and it transpired that during World War II, Tony Hibbert got caught behind enemy lines, and Tim Schmidt's parents had sheltered him and saved his life. So when Tim Schmidt appears in Cornwall and says, I think we should be doing more, at that stage they were losing up to 50 significant gardens were on the edge of being lost forever in Cornwall. So Tim Schmidt said, right, this is the story, the lost gardens of Heligan. What there were obviously written records, there were old photographs and histories and everything else, and they brought it all back together again. And then, interestingly, the first question about archaeology at Chysauster applies just as much with gardens. So you can, if you're very careful in the way that you, as it were, scrape the soil off, you will find traces of former paths. You will find traces of flower beds, because you can tell by the different colour in the soil that's there. And of course, you've got ruinous buildings. So you've got to sell the story. How do you sell the story? Have you seen the lost gardens of Heligan? Be one of the people who discovers it. So even when it was just vestiges, they start to open parts of the garden. So for example, when I first visited, the jungle garden was a dream. It long gone. You didn't see any of that. One of the first areas that was redone was the kitchen garden and the Italian garden were two that were done very early on. And with the hard landscaping, so where you've got paths or cobbles or whatever, with very careful archaeology, you can re-establish where they are, re-establish whether actually you need to lift them and relay them. And all of that is part of the ongoing restoration. But as you said in your question, how do you fund it? So you've got your visitor numbers. And the other element was Tim Schmidt was very good at getting funding from other sources, because if you can show, and I think this applies to many countries in the world, if you can show that you will create jobs, then you attract more funding, and you, particularly in an area where there aren't a lot of other jobs. If you can show that you're offering some form of training, that also comes into that. You then, once you've got something like Heligan up and running, you can have a restaurant, you can have an ice cream stand, you can have a very good shop. All of those generate income that goes back into it. And you have to be able to deal with numbers, and that's something Heligan's done very cleverly. You need to deal with numbers, but not so that people in the garden feel overwhelmed by the number of visitors. And it's a very, very clever balance, which they've achieved extremely well. I hope that answers your question. Do pop another question in the question box if you want me to talk about it a bit more.
Perfect. Thank you, Caroline. And our next question for you comes from Suzanne in Seattle. She says that she's spending 2+ weeks in London and Cambridge this summer, but they're looking to spend an extra 5 days exploring the countryside in England. Where would you suggest for their base of operations to be?
So the base of operations, yes, so I'm assuming, by the way, I live 25 miles from Cambridge, very good place to go and see. If you're going to base yourself in the West Country, what you need to look at, there are some wonderful, lots and lots of places that you can go and stay. I mean, if you wanted, I showed you Ensley. Ensley is a hotel. You can stay there. It's not cheap, but it's a very special place to stay. If you've only got 5 days, you have to bear in mind that whether you're driving or travelling by train, to get right to the far west of Cornwall, it's going to be a day each way. So you're probably better to pick Dorset and Devon, because you can get to them from Cambridge. And as I say, I'm not sure whether you're going to be travelling by train or driving. Driving from Cambridge, you can get to Dorset in about 4 hours. And the train, you'd need to go through London, and it would be much the same. Very good services through. I would imagine you are getting a car, because actually exploring the countryside will be very different. And right on the edge, the property I finished with, Minterne, is curiously, of all the properties I've talked about, the most remote. You will see more countryside round Minterne than you will see any other place. My other base is, if you like Agatha Christie, you could go and stay in Torquay, because that's where she was based. But that sort of area between Torquay and Totnes is quite a selection of places you can stay, and a really considerable number of properties, many National Trust properties, so that it's worth looking at becoming a member of the National Trust when you come over in order to go and visit their properties, or you can pay for each one as you go. Powderham Castle, right next to Exeter, is a lovely one. But look at what I've talked about, look at what interests you, and then find a hub, rather than moving each day. Because once you're unpacked, it's like going on a cruise really, once you're unpacked, you can then come back to the same place and you can eat out or do whatever you want in the evening. But you know your journeys, and anyway, so I have talked about Exeter, I've talked about Torquay, which takes you down onto the coast. And then going further, if you're going to go right the way down west and base yourself, shall we say, at Penzance, that would mean you could see the Scilly Isles as well. But pinpoint where you want to go, and in your 5 days, have a really good 5 days, and then come back and do the whole thing all over again, but in a different area.
Lovely, thank you, Caroline. And our next question for you comes from Dallas, who is in Andale in the United States. And their question is, how different is the microclimate in Devon and Cornwall to other regions in England?
That's a very good question. So the microclimate in Cornwall, it's that bit further south. It has more coastline. And you haven't got things like Dartmoor that you've got in Devon. So the microclimate in Cornwall is the best. And then by the very word micro, you go into a garden and you need to look for shelter. So from our point of view, the easterly winds are cold, winds coming from the north are cold. So if you are looking for a microclimate and you want warmth and shelter, you will look for something that is south facing. So that answers that. Now in Devon, in a curious way, you have more microclimates because you've got more extremes. You've got I've just talked briefly about Dartmoor, which is very bleak, and you've got much more height there, but then the soil is richer. You've got tucked into these areas the microclimate. Soil helps with microclimate. Depending on the plants, some areas, if they're drier, the plants tender plants will, particularly if they're Mediterranean plants, will survive over winter much better than having cold, wet feet. Nobody likes cold, wet feet. And then shelter belts. So if you've got trees around, that will again create a microclimate. The sea itself will almost guaranteed to prevent frost, but the wind and the salt coming off the sea is something else you've got to look at very carefully. So in principle, Cornwall is the warmest, followed by Devon, and Somerset probably is the same as Dorset. And then within those particular areas, you need to look where the best pockets are for whatever you're trying to grow. I've given you a bit of a broad palette there, broad brushstroke, but I hope that helps.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And our next question for you comes from Richard, who is here in the UK, in Cambridge. He asks, what would a garden planted only with species native to Devon and Cornwall look like?
Oh, that would be a Cambridge question, honestly. So the tree cover would be greater, because they, you know, as an island, we had far greater tree cover. So what species? And we're talking about, I mean, we're talking about hawthorn, and I'm not coming at, I'm trying to think. And then you've got the lower, gorse, of course, absolutely everywhere, and which survives very, very well. I'm using common names. I hope that's all right, rather than Latin names. Then you've got little lovely flowers like primroses, which settle, and they're so pretty in the West Country at the time. So they would be there finding their little corners. Then all the different grasses, and I really can't tell you which grasses, but it's worth remembering in the very earliest days that before wheat crops and other cereal crops were improved, people looked for grasses that had any kind of seed head that they could eat. But you'd be a combination. The major evergreens would be yew, and the moment I finish this, I shall think of a lot more, I know. And then you've got, for example, at this time of the year, we've got all our sloes in flower. Sloe is a native plant. You've got the hawthorn I've already mentioned, and I'm just trying to visualize what else we would have. We do, yes, juniper is native and was down in the West Country. So you've got quite a lot of evergreen cover. And then you'd have the sedges, grasses I've already mentioned, and the flowers. If I think of another one, as another question goes on, I will help you. Very different. And actually, if I'm going to be a bit awkward, I've got this with a project I'm running in Norfolk at the moment, where, we must go back to Breckland. It's Breckland. Well, Breckland followed forest, woodland. So where do we go back and what do we do? And we've got climate change. So when people are looking to have entirely native species and how it would look, we've got to take into account how far we're going back, the human incursions that go right the way back in time. And I mentioned about, saffron being introduced 3,000 years ago, near enough, by the Phoenicians. No, 2,500 years ago by the Phoenicians. What was the land looking like then? And I think the fruits, we had the wild sour crab apples would have been growing, but we needed it wasn't until Henry VIII we started really improving the apples. A very general answer to your question, I'm afraid. So next question, please.
Absolutely. Thank you, Caroline. And our next question for you comes from Sandra, who is in Brunswick. And she asks, what was the main motivations behind planting most of these gardens? Was it really for the owners to enjoy the properties at their own leisure, or was it more of a status symbol to show their wealth?
Well, I think it's that final remark. There is a question of the status symbol, but running alongside that is a desire, and that does apply. And when we've just with care, we've looked at so many of the gardens that are there. I mentioned with Tim Schmidt and the Lost Gardens of Heligan that at one point it looked like about 50 gardens a year were in danger of being lost. That if there were 50 being lost, how many were created in the beginning? So the fashionable nature, and I touched on this briefly when we were looking at the sort of Napoleonic early 18th century development of the gardens. And so if we go back to that, think of Mr. Wordsworth, William Wordsworth. What was he doing? He was lying pensive on his couch and he was dreaming of the daffodils he had seen. And at that stage in the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century was, let's explore our own country. Let's find where it's wild. And then we can go back to the last, 2 questions ago about microclimates. You then come by sea, don't forget, before the trains, because that's the best way you can come in. You build yourself a lovely property that you will live in for part of the year. And you have a really huge scale microclimate. At the same time, Kew Gardens ceases to be, for example, a royal property and becomes a botanical gardens effectively from the sort of 1840s onwards. Kew, I mentioned Veitches, who were big sponsors of plant hunters. You've got this interest. It's part of being in, it's polite conversation. Polite conversation includes science. That comes from the Enlightenment. What is the latest technologies we've got? It includes the plant introductions. And don't forget that the British Empire was at its greatest in the 19th century. So there was also an element of, let's look to the furthest parts of our empire and bring in trees from there. And plant hunters were going without our empire and beyond. And this was something that was happening right the way across Europe. Plus the fact that tax was lifted on glass in 1844, which meant glass became cheaper, glass technology improved. So status symbol is 100% the right way. So you have glorious orangeries, conservatories, you have ferneries, and you can do all of that, and you can walk the world within your own garden, and you invite your guests to come over and walk the world with you. But it's an educated approach. And in the 19th century, the level of literacy went up out of all proportion. The beginning of the 19th century, and I talked about the Veitches. A lot of Scottish gardeners came south because the level of literacy in Scotland was much higher. There was also very good work ethic. So that combination, and nurseries setting up, of being able to get really well-educated head gardeners and owners who are really interested in the plants that are coming in, you can sort of put them down a bit by saying it was a status symbol, but it was something they were enjoying and were usually very informed about as well. And a huge team of gardeners along with the head gardener, which all helps to keep the whole thing going. And I mentioned the family coming. It's worth remembering that in many cases, unless they did a lot of hunting, they weren't there for several months of the year, particularly the winter, which meant that they could do a lot of clearance work and major work on the gardens. I hope that helps answer your question.
It certainly does. Thank you, Caroline. And our next question for you comes from Krista, who is in Hindhead. And she asks, over your career, have you seen any changes in gardens due to climate change?
Yes. Yes, but we're hoping that I'd say a little bit more than that rather than yes. It's my initial reaction would have been that, which is still true, we can grow a far wider range of tender plants that you'd have thought, oh, I don't think that'll survive the winter. Going back into history, and I didn't show you a single photograph of an ice house. And I'm really too young for, I am definitely too young for ice houses, but things like lakes freezing over here in Suffolk, I can't think the last time that we had a sheet of water actually really freezing over. So yes, that's the main difference, is that the low temperatures in the winter have definitely stopped. And then, of course, every now and again you get a bad winter and the whole thing goes down. What has happened this last winter, and that has happened on several other winters, is the much higher rain water level, which I talked about Mediterranean plants not liking having their feet wet. That's a problem. And we have had more hot summers. And that seems to be gathering momentum much, much more. And I talked about this project in Norfolk. One of the things we've got to look to is what plants, because a lot of these are going to be semi-wild areas, they've got to be able to survive. And our climate has definitely changed, and we need to be very aware of it.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And our next question for you comes from Ralph, who is in the United States. He asks, are there ways to enjoy the gardens even if you have limited mobility?
That's a very good question. What are particularly gardens, the bigger gardens open to the public? Never mind climate change. What have I noticed in my career? The accessibility. And I remember, gosh, it would have been, well, I only spent 1 week in a wheelchair. And you do realise just how difficult it is when you can't get up and do anything. And I also took somebody in a wheelchair around gardens. That would be actually, I was in a wheelchair 20 years ago, so it would be more, 25 years ago. And I was horrified by how difficult it was. Now, with very clever ramps, many areas are accessible. And if they're not accessible, the thought has gone in that, okay, like the jungle garden at Heligan and some of the other, and even, I mean, the camellias at Carehays. But what they will do is create easy access to good viewing points. So it's a compromise, but you can't go everywhere. And so I'm delighted and we've had a big push here in the UK about accessibility and being aware of it. And not just around the gardens, getting in and out of buildings and garden rooms. And there are specific garden rooms that are being put up. And then the other disability, sight. And people are becoming more aware that you may not be able to see the garden. They've been aware of that scent is an important part if you have no sight. But the other important element of gardens, and that's where actually Australasian plants come in, is the sound. So if you've got somewhere, and that people will plant up with broad-leafed plants, so you get a wonderful soundscape from them. And of course, bird song. So all of those play to and touch is very important, soft leaf plants. And you'll have gardens where they will say you can touch the leaves, and hopefully you might get a nice scent as well. So I would always say, however, look it up. You will need to check, but in fact, I think it's probably they have to, in large gardens that are open to the public, they will have to make that kind of provision. If you're choosing to go through smaller gardens that only occasionally open, I would suggest need to ring to double check before you go.
Perfect, thank you very much. And our next question for you comes from Kaylee, who is in Claremont. She says, thank you for this fantastic overview. But if you only had one day in the West Country, which out of the houses and gardens that you described would you recommend to visit? It looks like you could easily spend a week to cover all of these beautiful sites.
Absolutely. Oh, golly, which one am I going? Oh, goodness. Now that, you think you're prepared for everything. Where am I going to go? Well, with the house, this is sadly, now this is not helping you, because my absolute favourite was Dartington Hall, and sadly it's closed. And I, funnily enough, was talking to somebody and I said, what is the news on Dartington? And they have the Elmshurst who put all the money in, they're selling up the land in order to try and do things. That was always my favourite. Which one? Actually, no, for a good story, I'm going to go for Powderham Castle, actually. And I mentioned the walk along the Roseland Peninsula, and if you like walking, do that as well, because it's a fabulous coastline to walk and enjoy the wild plants and the vistas into all the different houses. And the moment I finish this, I will think, oh, why didn't I say? And I love the Himalayan garden at Minterne. And I'm not answering your question, am I? Oh dear, no, I'm not being helpful at all. Just try and go and see all of them at some point.
You've been popped on the spot there, Caroline, I think.
Yes, I would. And actually, Heligan doesn't have a house open, so that may be. But yes, I have been put on the spot.
Absolutely. And then we've had a comment come in from Carol, who is in the United States, and she's said, such incredible knowledge. Thank you so much for sharing that knowledge and these beautiful pictures with us this evening. And then we've got our final question for you, which is from Paul, who is in London. He asks, apart from your own garden, what is your favourite garden to visit?
Well, do you know, everybody wants your favourite. And may I just say thank you to Carol? That's made, I shall be whistling around on my ego after that comment. Thank you very much. Now, Paul, yes, it's interesting if I could just talk about my own garden, because I do, as you probably gathered, travel a lot for work. I don't have enormously high standards, but the joy and pleasure I get out of my own garden is absolutely wonderful. Now, where am I going to go for my favourite garden? Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. I've got so many. And you see, I'm not answering your question because I suppose it's to do, I'm going to answer it in a very different way, actually, now I think about it. I, some years ago, was a speaker in Tokyo. And I had a friend who had grown up in a Buddhist temple, and I was going to take myself off to look at things. She said, I'm coming with you. So she duly came with me, and we reached the first garden, and she said, Caroline, this is a Buddhist garden. You don't march in and tick off everything you can see and identify the plants, and I know about this and I know about that. You let it inform you. So that's a lengthy way of saying that because I'm Western, because of my mindset, I want to go in and I do want to think, can I identify that plant? Oh, look, there's my favourite. It smells so good. Oh, wow, haven't they trimmed that hedge so beautifully? I wonder what's around that corner. But the gift she gave me that I've taken away is to take time to sit and stare. And I still haven't come to where my favourite garden would be, to sit and stare. And it's again with lockdown. I've just done, my last book was called Where the Wildness Pleases, The English Garden Celebrated. And I had to pick one, well, in the end, I decided it was easy to pick one region. And I picked a region called the High Weald, which is sort of West Kent and East Sussex. And I went round private gardens that are occasionally open, and I absolutely love them. And one that's readily accessible. Oh goodness. Okay, I'm out of those. I'm going to pick two. And they're both readily open to the public. And I know it's not the West Country, but I think it answers. Paul, you're in London, so you can very easily get to the High Weald because it's very good train services. I talked about Kew. It's sort of outshot Wakehurst Place, has the Millennium Seed project, where they're collecting seeds from all around the world. And to go to Wakehurst Place, you have the traditional house. You can't go in the house. And it's traditional gardens that were created by the Loaders. But it's now part of Kew, and so it combines botanical excellence, labelling, intelligence, and I'll tell you, and I will finish it, a little bit that I absolutely enchanted me at Wakehurst. And the question was, and it made children interested in gardens, if you were a plant hunter and you had to come back to the spot where you had gathered the seed or taken a cutting or whatever, how would you know where it was? And in the, it's actually in the American area at Wakehurst, it says, look around you and make up a story of what surrounds you. And then you'll know exactly where to come back to get your plants. So I like a little bit of intellectual exercise. So Wakehurst is right up there for that. Then Great Dixter was a garden created by the Lloyds, initially Nathaniel and Daisy Lloyd, and then their son Christopher Lloyd. And Christopher Lloyd, when he died, left it to Fergus Garrett. And if you like flowers and plants, it is still fabulous. And the topiary, which Nathaniel Lloyd planted over 100 years ago, is still wonderful. So I'm going to vote for those two, but I just derive huge pleasure of going into gardens and trying to read the personalities that have created them and the little plants that are surviving and listening to the bird song. So sorry, Paul, I can't say this is where you've got to go, but I've given you a couple to go to. So that is my last question. So I would like to thank you. It's been a really interesting evening and put me on the spot and made me review. And I know I shall say goodbye and good night. And then I'll think, oh, why didn't I say that? But you can always watch this again. And thank you very much for watching today.